Welcome back to the report. British Muslim identity seems to be the issue of the day, with continued debate at all levels of the society. Our reporter Yasmin Khatun has been exploring the topic by asking, what is British Islam?
The Prime Minister of Great Britain has said there's a need to lay out more clearly than ever what being a British Muslim means. But as the conversation around the topic continues, many Muslims feel like they've been pigeonholed into two categories. Either A, an assimilated Muslim, or B, a confrontational one. To demonstrate what I mean by both of these dispositions, in front of you here we've got prototype A and prototype B. Prototype A we'll call Sumayya and B we'll call Sarah. Sumayya is our happy assimilated Muslim. She might have featured in the Happy Muslim video or have no issue wearing a Union Jack hijab, or believe religion to be a purely spiritual practice. Whereas Sarah is perceived to be unhappy about everything, an antagonist who may believe voting is sinful, always wears black, and finds dancing in public abhorrent.
It's just stereotypical. You know, you can be covered and, you know, just be a good person, you know, like everyone else going to work. You know, it doesn't mean that if you're covered up, you're one of these. You know, people do cover and they do watch TV and they vote, you know, so everyone's got their own opinion and choices.
This mythical kind of dichotomy is propagated by many people within the establishment, within think tanks such as Quilliam Foundation, Henry Jackson Society and so forth. People with a very anti-Islamic ideology, trying to push this. You're either the perfect, you know, Muslim who just resembles us in every way, or you're with ISIS.
This image is just trying to radicalize Islam in a sense, but nah, it's not me. I can be modern and Islam at the same time.
It's like they're saying, you know, this is British values. What is British values? It differs from the very rich to the person on the street that's working on the building site. I'm sure they're going to say different things about what British values are.
So you don't think they're necessarily representative of the wider Muslim community?
I think the Muslim community is incredibly diverse, and more so because we live, you know, in the West as well. There's so many different influences on us, and I suppose there's more opportunities to do different things. So we kind of come out as a kind of, you know, hodgepodge, a patchwork of different things.
Unfortunately, the media has made it so that you see someone in a scarf or the way they dress, and it just makes you assume things about them.
The problem with these dispositions is that they're unrepresentative of the Muslim community, forcing two polarised boxes upon a group which, like any other, has varying degrees and threads. Conservative values are often placed into the antagonistic box, asserting that those who hold them don't fit into the ideals of British Islam or promote British values. Community Secretary Eric Pickles recently wrote a letter to over 1,000 different imams and faith leaders within the Muslim community here in Britain, asking them to assist the government in demonstrating how Islam can be a part of British identity. The letter praised the Muslim community for the different initiatives regularly undertaken by institutions. Though the Muslim Council of Britain, which is the largest Muslim umbrella body in the UK, criticised the letter for implying that Muslims had not done enough to challenge terrorism. In response to the letter, the MCB said,
"We take issue with the insinuation that extremism takes place at mosques, and that Muslims have not done enough to challenge the terrorism that took place in our name. We also reject suggestions that Muslims must go out of their way to prove their loyalty to this country of ours." The accusation comes on the back of an association between conservative Islamic practice and otherness, a thought encouraged by the media. At the launch of a report published by think tank Claystone looking at radicalisation and counter-terror policy, its author, academic Aaron Kundnani, argues it is British counter-terror policy over the last decade that has harnessed the idea that British Muslims are a problem community.
Whether that's people who are being imprisoned through miscarriage of justice, whether that's people under control orders, whether that's stripping people's citizenship, creating this atmosphere that of them and us, right? That Muslims are somehow this problem community, and that there's some need for Muslims to integrate themselves into so-called British values. All of these kind of notions have come out of counter-terrorism policy making and create this idea that that there's a problem with Muslims in Britain. We have these notions of the extremist and the moderate, right? And we try and fit all the different ways in which Muslims think about their identity into these two categories. We're constantly getting trapped in these misunderstandings because we don't have an effective conceptual framework to make sense of this issue of terrorism.
To be absolutely direct.
Over the last 10 years, the UK has acted out a muscular strategy under the banner of Prevent to fight radicalisation or extremist opinion here in Britain. Many have said that the strategy has specifically targeted the British Muslim community, a strategy Khatun argues has failed.
Analysis the government has is flawed. It doesn't stand up to the empirical evidence that we have about what causes terrorism. The government's analysis focuses almost entirely on the idea that religious ideology in some way causes terrorism. And what we're saying is that actually there's multiple causes to terrorism, and religious ideology has been massively exaggerated as the factor that drives it.
There is currently a major piece of legislation passing through Parliament, a bill which asks public servants, including doctors, nurses and opticians, to report those they may suspect to be on the pathway to terrorism. Actions taken to premeditate terror through seeking out extremist thought. But according to academic research, previous legislation of a similar nature has been counterproductive and bred ideas of otherness. Within the Muslim community, there's an unprecedented level of pressure as to how individuals can and should practice their faith. Pressures to confront extremist thought and an overriding atmosphere of suspicion over identifiably conservative practice and dress. For many Muslims in the West, finding a balance between traditional conservatism and reform is a difficult and contentious issue, one that transcends national borders. US scholar Dr Yasmin Khatun has travelled the world over holding lectures on finding that balance. And on a recent trip to London, I asked him about issues surrounding Muslim identity in Britain.
Let's be fair to ourselves and let others be fair to themselves. We will probably not conform 100% with the broader society around us. Does that mean we will always be aliens? Does that mean we're always going to be strange? No. We can contribute to this society. We can form our own subculture within the identity of England. And here's another point here. Who gets to solidify, uncodify what is British? Suppose 80% of England goes to pubs. What about the rest of the 20%, many of whom are not Muslim, but they're still not going to go to pubs, right? What about that percentage? It might not be the dominant narrative, but it is still an existent narrative, and it is a narrative that adds flavor to the broader British paradigm.
Dr Khatun did add that the problem occurs when we impose certain cultural practices upon Islam, using the example of the hijab.
That if you look at the laws of the Quran and Sunnah, they're very general and generic. How each society has taken those laws. So the hijabs and the dress codes of Malaysia and Indonesia are not like the dress codes of China and the Chinese Muslims, nor is that like the dress codes of Nigerian Muslims, nor is that like the dress codes of Afghani women or Saudi Arabian women. Yet the laws of Islam are being followed in all of those lands. The problem comes that when a Chinese Muslim, a Saudi Muslim, an Algerian Muslim, a Moroccan Muslim comes to the West and they think, oh, the only legitimate hijab is how I found my wife or my sister or my mother back home dressing, and so I have to enforce that cultural hijab. Now I'm using the example of hijab. It's not just hijab is the issue. Really, it's far more profound, but hijab is symptomatic of the greater issue.
As the conversation around Muslim identity in Britain continues, dialogue, understanding and interpretation seem to be vital to moving forward. Yasmin Khatun, The Report.
Well, joining to me to discuss all that are Dr Amina Yaqin from the School of Oriental and African Studies, writer Ahmad Thomson, and by Skype we're joined by Abdurraheem Green of the Islamic Education and Research Academy. Welcome to the programme, everybody. Amina, what's really happening here is that a political argument is being conducted by the government in religious terms, and that those two things don't marry, isn't it?
I think yes, and I think there's looking at that report and thinking about what one of the sort of issues that is underwriting that report all the way through is that breakdown of trust between the government and the Muslim community in Britain. And I say Muslim community with some caution, because as it's been argued by various people over sort of since the 9/11, I think that there are a variety of communities and there's a diversity to the actual population of Muslims that populate Britain. But what the problem is that a certain stereotype keeps getting reinforced of this is what a good Muslim community is, and this is what non-conformative to British values Muslim community is. And then there's a tension within that community that was kind of also being talked about in some of the people who were responding to the report by Arun Kandani, who was talking about the radicalization through the anti-terror legislation, and by the gentleman at the end, whose name I can't remember, but he was also talking about that move within the Muslim community from a homeland to the diaspora, and what happens to a particular sense of identification that one has of where one comes from, and what I think he used the example of the hijab as a formation, as a concept around, or a practice around which identification takes place for British Muslims and global Muslim communities as well, and that's become quite a highly charged issue, as we know, across Europe. We've seen that quite significantly, and I think what's interesting to note about that is how gender and women particularly become that conflictual point around which identities seem to form or fall apart, and I think with the government intervention, it also becomes very, very difficult for the Muslim communities to try and work out what their relationship is to the host country that they are a part of, to the global community that they belong to, and then, you know, the relationship with the British state and to ideas of multiculturalism and diversity and cultural diversity and the responsibility. Then you've got bodies like the Muslim Council of Britain who are appointed bodies, etc. Then
we'll just move on and bring up Thomson. I mean, isn't a large part of the problem here that this issue wasn't addressed in these terms until the War on Terror? And then the government went to war in countries which had predominantly Muslim communities, and part of the justification that they used was that these are regressive, medieval, we've all heard the clash of civilizations, we've all heard the language, and that couldn't help but produce a tension with the communities in this country that were also Muslim. That's the root of this to a large degree, is it not?
Well, I think the trouble is there's a lot of disingenuous kind of semantics that the government uses. Whereby when they're defining terrorism, they say, no, there's no such thing as state terrorism. There's only terrorism by individuals or groups of individuals. In fact, if you look at the invasion of Iraq, it was on very flimsy pretext. The Attorney General having said categorically you cannot use regime change as a legal justification for invasion. You had the expression of democratic will of millions of people marching in London to say don't invade Iraq. It was accepted that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, but it was on the back of that it was decided to invade Iraq. Over 1 million civilians, I'm not talking about people who are just defending their country being invaded, 1 million civilians were murdered.
And it was
and nothing is said about
that a particular community which was engaged in that.
People quite rightly are horrified by that, not only Muslims, a lot of people across the board. And when we talk about British values, if you look at the values that the Prophet Muhammad espoused, they include all of the best of British values. If anything, they will refine and improve them if people were aware of what they are. But this cannot be used as a pretext to say, well, this is quite all right for us to go and kill a lot of people. And if there's a reaction against that, then we will define that as terrorism. But we won't define our initial action as terrorism. That's one aspect. I think the other aspect is this, and it's very important to bear in mind that when we're talking about identity, it's a gradual process. There was a time, if you just go back a century, when Jews could not vote in Parliament, they could not be elected as MPs, they were regarded really as second-class citizens, they were tolerated because they managed financial matters very expertly. There was a time when they were actually banished from England and then accepted back. Well, but if I could say that gradually now they're in a situation where if they are insulted, if they are attacked, they immediately have the protection of the state. And now we find the same thing happening with the Muslims. They come, they're contributing much to society. And they feel really a grievance that they're not being treated fairly. There's a kind of double values being applied.
Well, we should bring
and in time, they will be accepted, just as the Jewish community.
Abdurraheem, isn't it the case really that the point that Ahmed's making is that, you know, who finds themselves as an outsider to British values is a pretty movable feast depending on the way in which the government and the authorities want to define it. Now it's Muslims. Before, when there were the Troubles in Ireland, it was the Irish, and in the 19th century it was the Irish. In between those two times, it was Jews. It's hard to take seriously a definition of British values that can, you know, pick on successive communities like that, isn't
it? Yeah, I agree with you, John. It's absolutely right what you're saying. I think. You know, as a community, the Muslim community, we do have some serious challenges in front of us. We have internal issues that we have to deal with, and I think one of the interesting or challenging things that we face is this whole issue of culture. A lot of Muslims in this country still have not got to grips with the difference between their cultural practices and what Islam teaches. And it's causing, I believe, it's causing a huge amount of conflict within families and communities, a lot of confusion. I mean, I just got an email today, interestingly enough, from someone whose father was threatening to separate from the family and accusing his daughter-in-law of being a kafir because she refused to change the name of their son. His name is Dylan. And he insisted that if she didn't change his name to a Muslim name, she was a disbeliever. I mean, it's this type of stuff that, you know, we're still dealing with. And this is the problem. People simply don't, a lot of people until now simply don't understand what's the difference between what Islam teaches and what culture dictates. And I think what's going to happen, back to the topic of British Islam, it's inevitable that, you know, I mean, the whole topic around whether we can call something British Islam is controversial. I don't want to get into that. But it's inevitable, if Muslims live long enough in this country, it's inevitable that something will emerge that is identifiably British and identifiably Islam at the same time. And Yasser was using the example of hijab. And, you know, there's many other examples. I would suspect that within time, British Muslims will consider, you know, queuing a Islamic virtue and being punctual and being on time, you know, probably one of the most important things, and consider a person who doesn't arrive on time to be, you know, committing a haram act. And, you know, from a particular point of view...
I'm sure we can all agree with that.
Yeah, but from a particular point of view, Islamically, you can justify it. You know, you should be on time. You should keep your promises. You know, you should be polite. But in other cultures, it doesn't take that same significance. So these things always develop. It's inevitable. But I don't see how it is helpful in any way, shape or form for the British government to start dictating what, you know, British values are.
Okay,
and what
well, just hang on there, because you've made a number of really interesting points. I just want to take them up. I mean that's true, isn't it? That happens, you know. That, but interestingly, on the other side, there are things that are never going to integrate. I mean, nobody expects British Jews to suddenly start wolfing down bacon sandwiches. That, you know, there's a bit there that doesn't integrate, and everybody realises that that's okay as well. And the problem with politicising it is it impedes that process, doesn't it?
I think yes, and I think the sort of word there is tolerance, isn't it? Where do you go from a culture of tolerance to a culture of cultural exclusion? And, well, what does cultural diversity mean? Does it mean that we only tolerate some people some of the time and we don't tolerate Muslims all of the time because they have become branded as part of the anti-terror legislation discourse that has been sort of around us? But then there's the longer history. I mean, if culture doesn't take account of the longer history of Muslim migrations to Britain, then how do you expect a youth culture, which is it's a large Muslim youth culture that is really responding to this call for British values, for British Muslim contexts. How do you communicate with that youth culture the history of Islam in Britain and how that has organically taken place, not just, you know, in a post-9/11 context, but historically a much older context of British history and through trade routes and through business and contact. So it's been about contact zones that have existed over a long period of time. And we just seem to be in a complete breakdown of, like I said before, of trusting each other. So there's no kind of sense of intercultural dialogue with I'm saying that sort of from a state perspective, that it gets projected as that. But certainly within the communities over there, and Jewish communities have been mentioned, I'm aware there are a lot of interfaith groups, for example, that are working towards bringing in that very type of diversity.
I mean, the point is that there are a myriad groups in British society that have something
within the Muslim community
and that have something in common with the people they live with, and some other things which they reject. And what's happening here in this political debate is the things that one particular community doesn't have in common with the other are being made an exclusive focus of debate.
Well, I think what happens historically, if you look at what's happened in other countries, when Islam first comes to a country, it inevitably acts as a filter of culture. So the aspects of the national culture which are permitted by Islam become part of their identity, and the bits which are contrary to it are rejected. So gradually Islam takes on an identity that is linked to the culture of that particular country, but also doesn't take it all on lock, stock and barrel. And I think, this, as I said earlier, the same process is happening in England. The same filtration process is happening. It will take time. But I can see a time when, just as in the past in English history, we've had Christian monarchs, Christian prime ministers, same with atheists, same with Jewish. There will come a time when we have a Muslim prime minister. Okay. And people won't be throwing up their hands in horror. They'll be saying, well, thank goodness for that.
Let me just bring Abdurraheem back in for a final comment. I mean, part of the problem here as well is that the last decade or so has been a process of terrific political mobilisation inside the Muslim community. And the government, perhaps it wants to blur the distinction between being politically opposed to the policy of the government and being an extremist.
Yeah, I think it's very useful for them. I think, you know, the raw facts are that most radicalisation, or, you know, people who commit acts of terror are simply because of British foreign policy. It's just, you know, it's pretty much amongst experts an undisputed fact. And it's very sad to see the establishment trying to gloss over that and pass the blame onto the Muslim community, who in this particular instance really genuinely, I believe, are innocent of this particular, you know, crime, so as to speak. And it's been turned, unfortunately, into a broader agenda to put down conservative Islamic values, to try and force a perceived notion of how they and where they would like Muslims to be. Like I said before, it's very unhelpful. I think it's going to be, if anything, it's going to be negative. It's going to delay the natural developing and evolution of a comfortable British Muslim identity. And unfortunately probably lead to more radicalization, not less. This is what I honestly, genuinely believe. And it's very disingenuous and dangerous. I do share the optimism of my brother Ahmed. I do hope that, inshallah, we're going to have a British Prime Minister one day. Why not? But I also, you know, I am worried at the same time. I am worried. And, you know, my appeal to the Muslim community, I think is very important, is that as a community, we do need to reach out. We need to make friends, you know, to get to know our neighbors, to be involved in community on an even more wider scale than we are, and to share the message of our religion and tell people what it's all about. I think that's hugely important.
I'm going to have to stop you there, but Abdurraheem Green, thank you very much for that, and my guests in the studio, Ahmad Thomson and Dr Amina Yaqin. Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this episode of The Report. I want to thank all guests on today's show and to thank you at home for watching. We'll leave you with scenes now from California, where local authorities have been working to halt fires that have burned over 5,000 acres across the Nevada foothills. Till tomorrow, good night.